Hey everyone, it's GosuDad, and welcome back to Season 5 of the Blizzard Online Ladder, and welcome back as well to Game 9. This was the game that I played last night, but if you remember from that previous cast, I had to speed through that replay review because my son and wife came home from their little trip to Joanne's and I believe Tokyo Joe's to get some wonderful dinner for me and my wife. We got to watch some Law & Order. But here we are back in Game 9, and if you also remember correctly, my opponent was AFK from his computer for the first little bit of the game, and I thought, even despite this, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at this game and see, how much of a difference it made for him to be behind and away from his workers for so long, and also to see, I think there were some pretty interesting engagements there. So here come his workers. Oh, look at that for a worker rush, just teasing there as he goes back to mining. So that's about a minute and a half without mining for his workers, and should be seeing an SCV coming from him right away. There we go, and here we are off to a good start. Now myself, going for the very typical Terran start of the supply depot and barracks at the front, which I've mentioned a couple times. It's questionable whether it's good to have your production structures be up close here where they are vulnerable to attack from the low ground. But in this case it doesn't matter. It's a 4-player map, there's a lot of distance, and the chance that my opponent will be attacking into this front wall is actually pretty low, which also brings up the point that perhaps it's less important for me to have this wall, although it does prevent scouting of your base. Which we will see my opponent scouting. So in his mind, in his game, it's about a minute into the game. So he's building his supply depot and canceling. That was an interesting choice. Wonder why he did that? Oh, because he's building it back here. So you can see my opponent building his supply depot here in the back instead, which was an interesting choice. And of course here I'm finishing off the wall with the supply depot. Now my main reason for doing that was to prevent him from scouting inside the base. Going for a 1-1-1 build, part of that, the final part of that 1-1-1 is the starport, and the starport having the tech lab does reveal what I'm up to, and in this case that would be the Banshee, the second B of the BYOB. Also going for the double refinery, if you remember from last time, and only putting 2 workers on each. Now 2 workers will produce about 80% of the total efficiency out of one of these mines, so 2's pretty not too bad. Now if we take a quick look at how many SCVs we have, looks like we have 11 SCVs on the mineral line, which is close to being half of the total. Well, it's about half of the total that you could possibly have to max out the mineral line. That would be 3 workers on each mineral. So some players might even go ahead and expand at this point. That's something I'd be interested in exploring later, is the timing of that expansion, and what are the pros and cons of going for an early expansion. So you can see here, by doing the double refinery, I had just enough gas to get this started, and then of course by the time it finished I have just enough gas to start the starport. So there's your typical 1-1-1 start, and as you can see from the mineral count, there's not a whole lot left over, and pretty soon I will be supply blocking myself, which you see I could have prevented by calling down some extra supplies or just simply building a supply depot. So that is one thing to be aware of if you're trying to keep a tight grip on your economy, is that if you're constantly using up this energy and pulling down mules, you won't have any energy for scans or possible extra supply drop if you need it. So here's the point where I get supply blocked, and this is where I think things get kind of interesting. So I'm supply blocked. If you look at our worker supply, we're 15 to 20, so it's going to take about 30 seconds or so for me to build the supply depot, and he is catching up on supply as we speak. So it takes about oh, look at that, he's got some SCVs banked up there, or queued up there, which is not necessary. So now he's up to 17 to 20, and pretty soon that supply depot is done. But you can see I'm not building SCVs here, I'm stalling here, and I think somewhere around here I'm going to decide to expand because I'm getting 400 minerals. And so he should be creeping up on me in that worker supply count, which I think is a good example of showing how, even though I had a full minute, I think a minute and a half a minute and a half where he wasn't doing anything. He is catching up in that worker supply. He's only down by about 3 workers at this point, and now he's only down by about 2. And the other thing to notice is that it took me until about the 7-minute mark before I scouted his base, because it was a 4-player map, and I basically scouted every single base out. So despite that advantage I had in the minute and a half, now here he is spending a scan, which is supposedly about 200 minerals, to see what's inside the base. And if we take a look at his view, ooh, not that kind of view. If we take a look at what he saw, he did see an expansion going down, so we'll see if he, and right now he's expanding as well. So actually at this point, even though he is down by 13 supply, he's keeping up, he's trying to keep up with that economy game. If we check out the worker supply, he's only down by 3, so he's actually keeping up fairly well. Let's check out the income, and we can see how close indeed we are. It looks like he's actually got a couple more guys on gas, and so that's why I have such a strong mineral lead. I don't know why my minerals just suddenly jumped up. Oh, it's because of this mule here. So I think at this point the real advantage that I had in that time, in that minute and a half, is that I produced more army units than he has. If we take a quick pause and look at the unit count, we can see that he's got 2 Marauders, which I have no Marauders, because I just recently built this tech lab. He's down about 5 Marines and no tanks, and of course a Banshee. But if you look at the worker supply, look at that, 21 workers to 22. So he's caught up in the almost 9 minutes. He's caught up, and his expansion is halfway built at his expansion. So whereas I'm going to have to move mine out. And as we see, we'll be seeing a bit, I'm going to go ahead and turn this into an orbital, which is going to slow me down even more. So, and spending yet another scan. So if he hadn't spent those 2 scans, that's another, in total, about 400. Ooh, he supply blocked himself. That does explain some of the differences in the unit count. As I mentioned before, I really think the advantage that I had is the slow building up of those army units. That's one of the things about the Terran build order, the Terran race I should say, is that they're really restricted with how quickly they can build their army units, or units in general. They can only build them one at a time. There's no chrono boost like the Protoss have to speed up the building. There's no larva production like the Zerg have that allows them to switch their production completely from economy to from workers completely over into combat units. And so a Terran versus Terran game is really about your ability to keep up with that unit production in comparison to your opponent. So at this point, if you remember from a couple of games ago, when I lost that Zerg player, I wasn't building enough building structures, and you can see I've got a lot of minerals banked up, so I will be putting down some more structures here. Now, looking at my opponent, he's still staying off of these essentially 3 barracks and 1 factory. And he's building tanks too, so and going for siege, so it'd be interesting to see what upgrades he has. He didn't have any. I don't think he had any upgrades. He looks like he's not researching anything. Oh, you researched concussive shell. I would have saved that money for one of these other 2 upgrades. Instead, combat shield or stim are much more useful, and he has not upgraded a supply blocked again. So I almost wonder how he would have done if he wouldn't have kept supply blocking himself. Although at this point now I've got 2 orbital commands, and that's just an insane amount of money. And even with these extra barracks, you really basically, when you expand to maximize your production, just double the production structures that you have for your 1 base. So in this case, I had 2 barracks and a factory and a starport, so I could build 2 more barracks, another factory, and another starport, and that would be equivalent to maxing out that 2nd base. So, I mean, I guess this is kind of like that lesson that I had, the previous game that I had in reverse, where my opponent is sticking on I mean, these structures aren't actually quite enough to even max out 1 base. So here he is finally building a starport. So we can see that the difference in the state of these 2 armies really is that unit count. Although if you look, the Marine count's pretty close, 15 to 20. He's got more Marauders than I do, and his tank count's only behind by 1. So that means the real differentiator would be the 4 Banshees and this Hellion, which, I mean, they do quite a bit of damage. I mean, that is a significant difference. And if he moves out to attack me, he will be at a disadvantage as well. Although at this point, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what would happen if he hadn't moved out, and we'll see that move out pretty soon at this point. So he's got a bunch of Marauders, a bunch of tanks, and he's like, okay, let's do something here on his side. Now with Terran versus Terran, I don't know. I don't know what the right thing to do here. He's got 2 orbitals chugging away. He's not supply blocked anymore, which is great. I'm not sure what he can see from my base. Now what's funny is that I have the same idea at just about the same time. So his force is moving up here, mine moves out, so it was just luck. Actually you can see him clicking there, and I should be clicking somewhere around here soon. But basically I was just A-moving, just select everything, attack, and then just focus. I think my camera, if we go to my camera view, I was focused completely on trying to fill this mineral lineup with workers. Now of course I could have maximized that a little bit better by taking workers from this line. As you can see, I've got a full 16, so even this mineral, that's an interesting point, even this mineral line at the 13-minute mark has not been maximized, which I think it really could have. So popping back on the screen here, now let's just take a look at these 2 armies. So his army's coming in, and he's got 7 Marauders and 3 tanks and 15 Marines compared to 24 Marines, so it's almost 10 more Marines. I think I have 2 more tanks. I only have 2 Marauders, but I've got these Banshees, and I think there's a Hellion in there somewhere. There he is. Okay, and these Marines have no upgrades. They do have combat shield. You can see the shield and their extra 10 hit point. That's actually a pretty big difference. I wonder what he has. Does he have any upgrades? He has no upgrades on his Marines. No upgrades on his tanks. So that, I think that's the key difference. It's amazing that minute and a half, and we both got supply blocked at different times, so I'd say those even out. So the minute and a half and maybe the timing of those supply blocks. But really, if you think about a minute and a half from, if we just take a look at these structures here, a minute and a half from the factory tanks take about 45 seconds. So that's 2 tanks, and Banshees are 60. So that's a difference of 2 tanks and a Banshee and about 5 Marines or so. And I did have 2 barracks here, although these Marines aren't anywhere close to the other ones. So that's about right. So about a minute and a half worth of production. So I mean, if you take these 2 armies and assume that they just cancel each other out, which if they did, that means I would have left over 4 Banshees and a Hellion and a little pack of Marines, which is enough to do a fair amount of damage. But moving across the map, they'd come up against his units, which are being produced at the same as well, although he has nothing to hit the Banshees specifically. So now the other interesting thing about this engagement, which I saw from the previous replay run at 8x speed, later on I did look at the replay a little bit, is how we decide to use the tanks. So in this case, I'll put the vision on him so we can see what he can see. So as he's moving in, he's not really seeing anything, and my units are not quite in range yet. So at this point he starts to see my guys. Now I don't know if he's really focused. Yeah, he can see him. So he can see him coming in. Let's slow this down a little bit, and we'll watch this engagement come out. So he's actually seeing attack move into here, seeing my guys, and now at this point he sees the Banshees. And now these tanks are going to come into range pretty close. Now the Banshees have a slightly faster speed. I don't know if they show speed on here. Move speed 275. If you compare that to the tanks, they're slightly faster than the tanks. I think all the tanks and the Marines, and I believe the Marauders, all have the same similar speed. So these Banshees are going to push ahead towards his force. Now the tanks, I think this is a very interesting point. So the tanks, when they are in this non-sieged mode, have a weapon speed of 1 and a damage of 15 but 25 to armored. Now when they go into siege mode, which we'll see in just a little bit, okay, so his choice here on that first hit is to take these units and put him into siege mode, which I think was a mistake. But I mean, given he had more Marauders and he had okay tanks, I think he might have been close for being able to nullify the tanks. But see, the time it takes for these tanks to siege up, the Marines have already done a terrible amount of damage. So remember, there are 24 Marines in this pack, and he had 15. He's already lost a couple so far. So the time, wow, just look at the time it takes for those tanks to do their first shot. Now, in their first shot, popping up the hit points tab, they did a ton of damage. See, this siege tank is almost dead, and a bunch of these units up here at the front are almost dead. But wow, actually look, I don't even think... Yeah, he's lost... The Marauders are still there. So it's actually... I think it's the... Oh, wow. In the time it took the siege tanks to siege up, the Marines just evaporated. So, you know, which, you know, I suppose we should expect from this type of engagement. You know, he's basically walking in. Now, even look at this. This is an interesting point, too. Like, these kind of hard to see. I can't remember. How do you... Is it page up, page down? No. Home and end? No. I can't remember. There's a way you can lean left and right. I'll have to look that up. But if you look here, these tanks in the back, that one had 1 kill. This tank hasn't done anything. So, to a certain extent, it was really a 4-tank to 3-tank battle with him having the advantage of Marauders. So now these Banshees, Banshees are just terrible. They have 2 attacks, so they do 24 damage each. So each of these 4 Banshees put together do about 100 damage in 1 shot, which is not quite enough to kill a Marauder, but it's pretty close. So it'd be interesting to see if he had done the same engagement and not seized the tanks. But regardless, he chose to seize the tanks, and they do get off a few shots. That one's going to die before he has time to shoot off, but before he has time to take a shot. And look at that, most of the Marines made it. There's nothing to heal them. The Banshees are fine. Now this is even an interesting note. See how this Banshee is damaged by 60 damage. That's because I believe units will favor, the automatic attack of units will favor air units. So that's another kind of funny advantage of bringing in air units. Look at that SCV. Into a fight, is that the defending units, or people that are attacking you, I guess, your air units can basically distract their ground units into attacking them. Likewise, this SCV, he took 35 damage. So between the SCV and the Banshee, they soaked up at least 1 Marine, maybe even a little bit more than that. And this Marauder completely unscathed. And in the end, I only had 3 tanks. So there you go. Kind of an interesting engagement there. And the Hellion, looks like he got 1 kill. So I don't know. That was pretty close. Now back at his base, I have a feeling, and you know, we'll take just a quick look back in time. Let's see who was building what when that engagement was going on. It looks like, yeah, look at that. Let's go back just a little bit further. Okay, so right before the engagement, he actually wasn't building anything out of his barracks, and he had plenty of money to do so. He could have been building 3 Marines at that time. But just watching it in slow-mo to see how we are keeping up with our production while we're fighting. Now in my case, I just aim, so of course I'm going to be producing more. But you can see we're distracted here. We're not, both of us could be building things out of our barracks. We're not supply blocked or anything like that. So now I think it'd be interesting to see how, because he's got a tank, he had a tank on the way. I think that's this one. I don't think he could have held off the attack, basically, especially with the 4 Banshees, unless he had some missile turrets. But if you look at his mineral count, he could have had, wow, now 14 extra Marines or whatnot. So he could have actually had quite a defensive force had he been up on production, just as I had an issue with production in the last game. It would have been interesting to see if he would have had Vikings instead of medevacs. Because the Vikings can take down these Banshees no problem. In fact, these Banshees are they armored? No, they're not armored. They're light mechanical. But the Vikings do a pretty decent damage against air. And of course the Vikings can't attack back. Or sorry, the Banshees can't attack the Vikings back. So yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting game, even despite, well, and look at this. Now he's actually ahead on worker supply than I was. So So I think that's very interesting. That I think this game really came down to each of our abilities or lack of abilities to keep up with the production and to not supply block ourselves. Both of us supply blocked ourselves at different times, and I mean, even here you can see he's got queued up researches. Oh, this one's almost done, so I'll forgive him that. But you know, both of us could have been building units while we were having this engagement at the front. So I think even with that minute and a half, he could have made it a pretty close game. The other thing is that as the game goes on, which is another note, is that if you find yourself that you're behind, it's actually in your favor to keep the game running long. Because as the game runs long, at some point, as you saw with this worker count, where he was able to match me in workers and surpass me in workers, as time goes on, the players start to max out. And down here in the Bronze Silver League, I think players do have a hard time branching out to that third base, even being able to maximize the efficiency of that first base. Like if you look here, boy, I only have 2 workers mining minerals. So so I think, although he had that AFK moment at the beginning of the game, I think this game really came down to the actions that happened later. And especially if I hadn't pushed at this point, it would have given him time to make up for that difference. And actually, if he hadn't pushed at that particular point, I think that the game would have been a little more even, especially if I was forced to move out against a siege line. I mean, imagine having 3 more siege tanks and the rest of his units here to defend against this. I think it would have done much better. So, but yeah, an interesting game, despite it being super short. And I could tell that I've talked quite a bit. So this is GosuDad signing off, and we'll see you guys later.